Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Deborah Fitzgerald. I'm the Leverett Howell and William King Cutton Professor of the History of Technology in the Science, Technology, and Society program at MIT. On behalf of the STS program, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event. I'll first give you a brief history of the Morison Prize and Lecture, and then introduce you to the recipient of this year's Morison Prize, Dr. Alondra Nelson. The Morison Prize and Lecture in Science, Technology, and Society, established by the Morison family and the Hitchiner Manufacturing Company, recognizes the technical and societal accomplishments of several generations of Morison family members, in particular Elting Morison, who was instrumental in establishing the STS program in the 1970s. We also want to recognize the engineers at the Hitchiner Company who have supported this prize for so many years. The Morison Prize recognizes the accomplishments of a scholar who has made major contributions at the interface between science and technology on the one hand, and the matters of societal concern on the other. This year's recipient of the Morison Lecture and Prize is Dr. Alondra Nelson. Dr. Nelson is president of the Social Science Research Council and the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She is an acclaimed researcher and author who explores questions of science, technology, and social inequality. Nelson's books include Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, and also The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. She's the co-editor of Genetics and the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History with Keith Wailoo and Catherine Lee, and also Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life with Tai Lin Tu. Nelson serves on the Board of Trustees of the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation, and on the Board of Directors of the Teagle Foundation and the Data and Society Research Institute. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. During Dr. Nelson's lecture, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions or make comments. Following the lecture, there will be a Q&A session where I will be asking a few of your questions, as many as we have time to manage. So with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Nelson for joining us today. Dr. Nelson, please.
Thank you for the introduction and for the honor of the Morison Prize. I'm incredibly honored and touched to receive this recognition from my colleagues. And also a little bit saddened. We were supposed to do this in March. We were supposed to be together in Cambridge in March, but there were other plans for us. And so I'm glad that we were able to do it in this format here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about The Social Life of DNA, the book, and also things that I've been kind of thinking about since the book was published as well. And I will end with a few considerations about the geneticization or the sort of endeavor to geneticize the novel coronavirus. So let me bring up my slides here. So let me begin here. So I wanted to say, just to start a little bit, to situate my work for those who don't know it. For much of my career, I've been writing about African-American communities' engagement with science and technology, and in particular with genetic science, both in its 20th century form and its 21st century form more recently. And that has included my book, Body and Soul, that Deborah kindly mentioned, which was about the Black Panther Party's health activism, but importantly for today's conversation, bridges to my more recent work, and that it was also about the use of African-American communities, often lay people, their use of new genetic technologies to get access to healthcare that was being denied them, and to effectively get diagnostic information about their health that they didn't have access to. So Body and Soul was published in 2011, and then the American Journal of Public Health did a special issue commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party in 2016. And more recently, I've written about direct-to-consumer genetics and genetics in the unsettled past and the social life of DNA. And I want to suggest to you that the kind of question for me that both draws all the work together, and I think indeed haunts the work, if I'm to be quite honest, is this. Why and how do communities that have been the objects of scientific scrutiny, technological surveillance, and what Harriet Washington calls medical apartheid become subjects and agents in science, technology, and medicine, and at what cost? And so it is that, for me, kind of poignant question that has really been the touchstone for so much of my work, and including the work that I began about 15 years ago, spending time with the early adopters of direct-to-consumer genetics in the United States. So despite this, genetic pioneers in quotes, like Craig Venter, as late as recently as 2010, were saying things that we have learned nothing from the genome. We heard similar language in the same year from the now retired New York Times journalist Nicholas Wade, who did a lot of damage and really racializing genetics and the work that he did. And as he was leaving the New York Times, would publish, frankly, a racist book that took genetic inferences and made sort of broad strokes attributions to nation states and large swaths of continental swaths based on genetic inference. But even Nicholas Wade, the point here is that someone who is, a kind of quote unquote true believer in the power of the genome and what it's supposed to say about society, was imagining that there were few cures, that there was still much that genetics had not told us at this time. So in my work, I was seeing something very different. So that maybe that there weren't genetic cures, maybe that, to use Venter's word, we'd learned nothing from the genome. But beginning in 2003, I began to spend time with African-American genealogists who were just making the turn to become genetic genealogists. And in making this turn, we're really having to reckon with lots of things about the history of genetics, about the history of eugenics, and also about their own personal yearnings for knowledge about their ancestry, or inferences about their ancestry that they hadn't been able to necessarily discern otherwise. And so while by 2010, some were saying, we've learned nothing from the genome. By this time, I had for 7 years been tracking ethnographically the incredible use of a new technology by African-American communities. These are just 2 slides from my early field work in New England. This was in Massachusetts at a conference, a convention of the African-American Historical and Genealogical Society. It gives you a sense here of the transition from conventional genealogy to genetic genealogy, because in part what's taking place here is kind of education for lay people about genetics. So one woman here holding a model of a double helix. Others pictured here at the same session are holding up the sort of molecules that comprise the protein that makes DNA. So they're literally getting taught what it is they're transitioning into as truly early adopters. So I'll just plant a flag here that we can come back to, which is just to say that here we have a new startup industry, and we think of startups as coming out of Silicon Valley. This one came out of sort of partly Silicon Valley, if you think about 23andMe, but also places like African-American communities in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. In this case, these early adopters are significantly senior citizens, so they're not the sort of young, just out of college or just out of MBA programs that one might consider. And so as we're narrating, increasingly the sort of history of direct-to-consumer genetics, this is actually an important kind of cornerstone moment that I think gets lost, in part because, because of the sort of, these are older African Americans, but also because to not narrate this cornerstone also allows the industry to also not narrate the complexities that come with geneticizing ancestry. So this is also from that same field work, and this was being hosted by an organization that I spent a great deal of time with, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the New England branch. The sort of national organization starts in 1977 as all of the kind of Alex Haley miniseries and fictionalized book is taking place. And I want you just to note that the slogan here is life, continuity, and eternity, which I always found quite poignant. So spending time in this group, it became clear to me that, there's a lot of, I think, talk about genetic ancestry testing, particularly in the current moment, in part as by being kind of part of the quantified self movement. I think that's true in part, but people are trying to actually quite reckon with kind of quite significant issues and problems, particularly African Americans. And very early on in the work, and I'll raise it here today as well, I thought again and again about the Langston Hughes's poem, A Harlem, which begins, "What happens to a dream deferred?" And part of I want to suggest that the dream deferred, that direct-to-consumer ancestry testing, is sought as a kind of, is sought as a vehicle for our kind of dreams of freedom and connection, and really kind of agency in the world that many that I spoke with and spent time with felt denied to them because of this lack of information that was important to them. Does it sag like a heavy load, or does it explode? And it also, I think this poem for me suggests all of the kind of vexing issues and complexity that emerge out of turning to genetics, making the Faustian bargain to turn to genetics to get some inkling of one's ancestry or one's background. So in my work, I use the phrase reconciliation projects to try to make sense of endeavors and social practices that began with direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing. So a lot of the commercial and advertising representation of direct-to-consumer genetics suggests that the ancestry inference that can be, a sort of proportion of different, ethnic backgrounds or racial backgrounds, depending on what tests one uses, or might be, a haplotype group, a sort of distant place in time or in space, is the kind of endpoint. And, what I found in my research is that it actually, for so many, is a beginning point and not an endpoint. So, and at the beginning point often are these reconciliation projects. So for me, reconciliation projects are practices in which genetic analysis is put to the task of resolving controversies or answering questions about the past. In my work, I've been particularly interested in reconciliation projects in which people of African descent are engaged, and that often have something to do with trying to reckon variously with the history of racial slavery. And I'll say a bit about that, more about that in the second part of my talk. But I want to come back to this kind of larger framing, because what I really try to sort of foreground this discussion of the uses by African Americans and some Black Britons that I write about of direct-to-consumer genetics, and a larger kind of conversation about what I understand to be actually kind of world historical practices of reckoning and reconciliation. So I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about one that I write about in my book, but I think that there are many of these in which we seek out forms of genetic analysis, from direct-to-consumer genetic testing to sort of government laboratory testing, in the case that I'll talk about next, to kind of ancient DNA analysis to answer these questions that feel unsettled or controversial in the present moment about the past. And so, I use the word forensic in my book, and forensic we often will use to as sort of medical forensics or a CSI lab. But I was very interested in understanding forensics as having a kind of truth-telling power, as being something that's analogous to making a pleading in a sort of court of law, or the root of forensics is a forum. So in a kind of having a public hearing about something that is controversial, or in this case something unresolved from the past. And so for me, forms of genetic testing, be them direct-to-consumer genetics, or more recently, the turn to ancient DNA, can be used in this kind of forensic way to make a public pleading in the sort of court of public appearance, court of public opinion, and as I'll talk about in the reparations case, in a civil court, to try to plead or make a point about the past. So I will talk about this class action reparations suit, Deidre Farmer versus Fleet Boston, a little bit later. But I wanted just to suggest to you some of the things just in this one slide about the kinds of reconciliation that these tests, these inferences made possible. So I spent some time following the actor Isaiah Washington, who is now an avid Donald Trump supporter. He was able to get dual citizenship in Sierra Leone based on his genetic ancestry testing from a company called African Ancestry that I spent a lot of time following. And so part of what was attempted to be reconciled was a romance, or yearning to be connected to the continent of Africa in some way. And for this, for Washington, this was manifest in being able to actually have formal citizenship in Sierra Leone, a country, a state that he was linked to through mitochondrial or matrilineal DNA testing. This kind of citizenship desire takes other kinds of manifestations as well. So there are, there's things like diaspora passports. There are various ways in which, both because of, I think, romantic ties, but also certainly because of the hope of, sort of a political economy of a diaspora, that people are able to variously connect with the African continent in different ways. They're naming ceremonies and these sorts of things that I write about just a little bit. And then below is a photograph from my field work taken at Magnolia Plantation, which was a former slave plantation. And this was a ceremony kind of commemorating those who were lost in the transatlantic slave trade from what is contemporary Sierra Leone to the Carolina Lowcountry. And so here you have the three people in the center. The woman in the purple sweater is a woman named Tomalin Polite, who can, through slave ship manifests and other kinds of, brick and mortar, pen and paper evidence, link her family to contemporary Sierra Leone. Isaiah Washington, as I've mentioned, is inferred to have Sierra Leonean ancestry, matrilineage, based on direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing. And the gentleman in the sort of purple tunic was there to kind of oversee, as a griot, to oversee the ceremony to commemorate ancestors lost. And so the reconciliation, of course, is also about, communities of people of African descent variously. So I want to say, before moving on, that that I just want to sort of put a big asterisk and lots of scare quotes around ancestry, around sort of relationships between people, and point people to a policy brief that I wrote with some colleagues in science many years ago, which was about making the case for all of the constraints about genetic ancestry testing. So this is just to say, I want to place this as a placeholder for all of the limitations that we can discuss further, but about which many of you are well aware. So to return to reconciliation projects, I write in my book about Mary Claire King, who the geneticist, the Berkeley trained at Berkeley geneticist, who plays a really important role, and I think in the sort of creation of the kind of world history, one might say, of direct-to-consumer genetics, and that she first uses HLA antigen testing or blood analysis to try to discern where are the disappeared grandchildren of the victims of the dirty war and post-junta Argentina. So beginning in 1977, many of you know, the grandmothers of the May Plaza came out every week to demand the return of their disappeared grandchildren who had been placed in, we now know, in the families of, often families of people who were close to the authoritarian regime. In some cases, sons and daughters were disappeared. We now know that there were effectively these kind of birthing concentration camps in which activists and students were killed, were murdered after giving birth often, and then their children were disappeared. And so there's been, over 180 cases of which, in which these young people have been, now in their mid-20s have been identified. And for many years, this was a state project of Argentina using early genetic analysis to try to reconcile these families, and in reconciling these families, arguably trying to reconcile a nation state as well. And so for me, it's become, important to think about direct-to-consumer genetics and these reconciliation projects in this larger context in which genetics is sought as a kind of forensic vehicle, as I say, to make this public pleading, or to make, in some cases, a formal legal pleading about the past, using it as evidence. In the United States, the forensic evidence also takes the form of kind of truth and reconciliation commissions that look something like the South Africa case that have taken place in large ways and small ways in the United States, mostly unknown, I think, to many Americans. So some of you might be familiar with the Greensboro Massacre, which takes place in 1979, and Greensboro, North Carolina, and after which becomes a community is left to grieve, and a community is left with the trauma and the injustice of what happened, and indeed the kind of, the racism and anti-Semitism of what occurred. This encounter, this massacre, and also what comes after it is detailed wonderfully in Jovanovich's book, Truth and Reconciliation, and Greensboro, Democracy, Dialogue, and Community Action. And this work of reconciliation has become, felt a lot nearer and more poignant when I was working on the book and trying to contextualize the use of direct-to-consumer genetics that I was seeing. It felt in some ways very far away, but of course I'm showing here the stash of guns from the KKK that were confiscated after the massacre, as we sit in a moment in which sort of armed violence and armed militias, racist militias, so white supremacist militias are indeed, walking the streets of the United States, probably with caches of weapons much more significant than this. One might imagine that we will need to have in the United States, finally, I think many have called for this for a very long time, something like a truth and reconciliation process with all of the sort of uncertainties, complexities, and ultimately things that are unreconciled. I mean, if we think about the way that Mahmoud Mamdani writes about what actually doesn't occur in the Truth and Reconciliation Program in South Africa, the Commission in South Africa, and the sort of creating a kind of fetish around social work that doesn't actually necessarily result in the resolution that people are seeing. But this is a case in the United States in which here witnessing actual community testimony, people bearing witness to what they saw, to the effects that it had on them and to their trauma, became the kind of forensic vehicle. And so in thinking about reconciliation projects, I'm both on the one hand in my work interested in particular projects that are about giving voice in some way to racial trauma on the one hand, and on the other hand, thinking about genetics as a particular vehicle for doing that, which is why I bookend these two here for you. So the particular reconciliation projects that I'm interested in my work and today are particularly about injuries deemed to have been produced by racial slavery and the use of genetics in some way, in some fashion, to try to reconcile those. So I'm going to tell you about one more recent case and then go back to the cases that I write about in my book. So this is Richard Cellini, who is an alum of Georgetown University and who's been a really driving force and endeavors at a reconciliation project that's been taking place at and around Georgetown University regarding the GU 272, the nearly 300 people who were enslaved by Georgetown College and 1838 were sold down to Louisiana, many of them and families, by the Jesuit stewards of Georgetown College in order to keep the institution afloat. Cellini has really been a driving force behind a project of using genealogy and moreover genetic genealogy to try to find the people who are the descendants of the GU 272. So in a series of articles, you'll probably be familiar with this one from the New York Times that Cellini says, this is not an disembodied group of people who are nameless and faceless. These are real people with real names and real descendants. One of these real people with a real name was called Isaac Hawkins. This is a little bit of the pedigree chart of his family. But now, soon after this project got underway, which is called the Georgetown Memory Project, that was started by Cellini as a nonprofit. It became also engaged in hiring a genealogist who's familiar with Louisiana and Catholic Church history records in particular, and also using genetic genealogy. And so one of the things that's been interesting is the turn to genetic genealogy and tools that had been used for kind of large scale sort of community-based genealogy projects. So this is a wiki tree for genealogists, was turned to the work of trying to find the descendants using genetic markers of Isaac Hawkins. So that was an open source one. But quickly, the Georgetown Memory Project soon were encouraging people to use the product of Ancestry.com, and which offers both conventional genealogy services for a price and with a subscription, as well as direct-to-consumer genetic testing as well. Those are two, as we can discuss, very different epistemologies and systems of kinship and thinking about relation, and yet Ancestry.com and some other of the services are able to help people think about them together. And in some instances, one offers clues to the other. But I think for the purposes of scholarly work, they're systems in some ways that are, in fact, incommensurate. So this is just this is the actual a pedigree chart of a person who works, Jeremy Alexander, who happens to work at Georgetown, who turned out to be one of these descendants. So the complexities here we can talk about a little bit more, but of course it is the case that the sort of tragic irony of charging the descendants of slaves, the sort of price of admission to Ancestry.com, the subscription price one has to sort of re-up every year, unless you buy a multi-year subscription, to get information about their ancestry, to effectively compel people to participate in this project around the GU 272, to have to give their DNA to a large commercial company that from time to time has been known to collaborate with the criminal justice system. I think sort of really adds insult to injury, to say the least. So I've been writing about this particular reconciliation project, the GU 272 one, for the last couple of years as a case of what I'm calling kind of institutional morality. I've been very interested in a moment in which, and I think this has only become more acute actually, and which increasingly many of our institutions lose the ability to sort of take a moral high ground with regards to issues of anti-racism and racial equality in particular, but lots of other things besides, right? And part of this is just about, I think, the kind of collapse of trust in institutions and norms that have been happening all around us. And so the Georgetown case is particularly interesting because, arguably, a Jesuit university brings with it a kind of, the expectation of a kind of institutional morality. And as I described in this article in the British Journal of Sociology, it also brings back to what had become a kind of institutional social movement, right? Beginning in 2002 with Brown University and Ruth Simmons kind of bravely, having a conversation and commissioning, a multi-year study of the roots of Brown University and the Brown brothers, the Brown family, and racial slavery, and the implications of that for Brown and the contemporary moment in the early aughts, as was the case there. As I note in this article, that report that comes out on slavery in Brown University is explicitly also about justice. And then the reports that would come out, University of Virginia, Yale, Princeton, many other institutions, College of William and Mary, don't use the word justice, and you don't really see it again until Georgetown. And so there are, to the extent that institutions are engaged, and for good and for not, and for reasons that are about the legitimacy of the institutions. I mean, I also make the argument here that to be an elite educational institution and have legitimacy in this moment in the United States, if it is an institution of a certain, that goes back to the era of slavery, that an institution must sort of perform itself as having institutional morality by engaging in a discussion of this and of the history of racial slavery at the institution. And so the Georgetown case centers here. It's a kind of mini case study of that, and the DNA analysis, of course, and the role that plays, and locating, which is now more than 5,000, I think not quite 10,000 descendants vis-a-vis, through genetic and conventional genealogy and Richard Cellini's Georgetown Memory Project. So that's a kind of ongoing reconciliation project in which, DNA plays a central role. I want to tell you about one of the several. I write about 5 reconciliation projects in the social life of DNA, and one of them is about a historic class action suit for reparations for slavery, which is led by it's a class action suit of 8 plaintiffs, and the lead plaintiff is a woman named Deidre Farmer-Pahlman, who's a longtime reparations activist here in the United States, in New York City, more specifically. She's interesting in the larger sort of account that I tell in the social life of DNA because for many reasons. I mean, some of one of the companies that I follow emerges out of the African Burial Ground Project in Lower Manhattan, where she was an activist, and she's quoted in press interviews talking about feeling, having a sense of being hailed and being called upon by her ancestors to sort of do something about the history of slavery, and moreover to rest the souls of the people that were being, the bodies that were interned at the African burial ground and that were being disturbed in what was started as a construction project and would become an academic research project, an archaeological project, effectively. So she really kind of is through, runs through and through the account that I'm telling in these reconciliation projects. But in this instance, she's a very important figure in the history of reparations politics in the United States, which notably African-American women figure centrally. And we can talk more about that, because as reparations gets taken up as a larger story and as a larger movement, it's critically important that this kind of earlier story be told about Deidre Farmer-Pahlman, about Mother Deloise Blakely, and others. So Farmer-Pahlman was also in the news in the late 1990s and early aughts because she was trying to, use commercial sort of corporate data archives to sort of discern if one of her relatives had been enslaved and insured by Lloyd's of London on behalf of someone who had enslaved her family. And so this endeavor, this personal endeavor, becomes a larger endeavor. In 2002, as I said, she becomes the lead plaintiff for a case that begins in the Eastern District Court of New York City, Farmer Pellman versus Fleet Boston, in which she and 7 others, and on behalf of her and herself and those 7 others and all persons similarly situated, sue 21 multinational corporations: Fleet Boston, Aetna, CSX, and 19, 18 others, for reparations for slavery. This court case is a civil case, so it's a kind of tort law case. Prior endeavors to use the court to ensure some prior efforts to sort of compel the state to pay reparations for slavery had really come up against, and the prior cases had been about 100 years prior, had come up against the doctrine of sovereign immunity, which meant that the government cannot sue, it cannot be asked to sort of sue itself effectively. And so here they were trying an unproven strategy. They're using a civil court law, a civil court strategy, and also not suing the state or jurisdictions of a state, but actual multinational corporations. And the argument being that none of these corporations would exist today if not for the proceeds of racial slavery. So this case enters the courts in 2002. Here's from the New York Times. Companies are sued for slavery reparations. It seeks unspecified damages from Fleet Boston, Aetna, et cetera, stating that they or their predecessor companies profited from slave labor. By 2004, you will not be surprised to hear that an appellate court in Chicago, this is where the case traveled, that the case had been dismissed. The judge, Charles Norgal of the Federal District Court, said the plaintiffs had shown no clear link between them and the companies. And moreover, the case was sort of dismissed, and suggested the dismissal suggested that the plaintiffs did not have standing, that they not only there was not a clear link between them and the companies, that they could not demonstrate that they were the injured parties who should be the ones that would be allowed to sue. And here's from the dismissal. The plaintiffs cannot establish a personal injury sufficient to confer standing by merely alleging some genealogical relationship to African Americans held in slavery over 100, 200, or 300 years ago. So Farmer Pellman and one other of the plaintiffs and the class of defendants decide that they're going to go to a company called African Ancestry, which is the company that I follow most closely. So this is a Black-owned company started by an African-American geneticist, Rick Kittles, and businesswoman Gina Page in 2003. And they go to this company to sort of see if they can get evidence, right? That proves that they're not, quote unquote, merely alleging a genealogical relationship to formerly enslaved Africans. And so they offer this, not because it's a civil case, it's not evidence as one would, put a place in a criminal case, but they write a briefing in which they share the results of their genetic ancestry inference, which suggests inferences to Niger, Ghana, and other places in West Africa are held by the people in the plaintiff class. And they say they're not merely alleging, we're offering evidence that that there is an actual tie, that there is an actual link between us and our ancestors, and therefore between us, our ancestors, and the companies. So this is Farmer Pellman and one of her attorneys. So notably, one of her attorneys had a couple of years prior successfully sued Swiss banks for reparations on behalf of Holocaust survivors, and they were using a similar strategy here in the United States, of course, in a very different court system. So by 2006, the appellate court has rejected the slavery reparations claim, effectively saying that that they didn't have standing still. And moreover, it becomes, before the Supreme Court case, the myriad genetic case, in which we have law starting to be built a couple years later around this, what is the status of this new genetics after the Human Genome Project? How do we think about property, about rights, about access? Here you have, in a civil case in 2005, a kind of, a few paragraphs of kind of legal consideration of direct-to-consumer genetics. So part of the dismissal says genetic mapping or DNA testing alone is insufficient to provide a decisive link to homeland. And so that reconciliation project doesn't succeed, and indeed none of the reconciliation projects really succeed in the social life of DNA. Partly what I'm interested is in the endeavor and the attempt to do that. So just to give you a bit of a timeline, this is an industry, direct-to-consumer genetics, that begins in the United States in about 2002, 2003. Of the kind of initial first few companies, one of them was a Black-owned company, African Ancestry. Of the kind of first 4 companies that were around in 2003, only 2 of those still exist: Family Tree DNA and African Ancestry. So not only was this Black-owned company that was used for to provide a kind of a forensic claim for slavery reparations, there early on, but moreover, reparations activists within kind of a year of the industry coming to be really sort of saw it as a strategy that they might leverage for a long-standing, generations-old, hundreds years old endeavor to provide reparations for slavery. And I want to suggest that, by the time a few years later, 2014, that Ta-Nehisi Coates, publishes the case for reparations in the Atlantic, that really sort of is a kind of groundswell of public conversation in the US about reparations, that it really has this, that we have to imagine and understand that this slavery reparations case was really a kind of passing of the baton, like keeping in public discourse, keeping in conversation the case of reparations. And so this DNA reconciliation project is important for that as well, and arguably for bringing, allowing us to be having that critical conversation right now as well. So I talk about tracing the work of these tests through a process I call the social life of DNA. Obviously this comes from Arjuna Potterai's 1988 essay to his edited book, The Social Life of Things. It's used a lot in STS. Sarah Franklin uses it to talk about, the social life of PGT, PGD, of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and others have used it. Nigel Dodd uses it to talk about the social life of money. So I don't claim to be doing anything novel here in the world of social science. But I think what was very helpful for me about thinking about the Potterai concept is that it was not just, it allowed me to get away from the sort of test results as being the thing that was important, and to be able to see that it was following what people endeavored to do with their test results, including in their use in this reparations case, including uses for trying to accomplish kind of diaspora citizenship variously, and there's some other instances I can talk about in the Q&A, was really about how they came to live in the world, and really it was following that was central for me. So I use the social life of DNA in 2 ways. One is the kind of spillover between sites of genetic analysis from genetic genealogical uses to other domains and back again. And then also the multiple uses to which one type of genetic analysis is put. And so in the book, I'm tracing the multiple ways in which my informants, the people I spend time with, put into practice the ancestry inference results that they receive. So the same test, genetic ancestry testing, and how that moves around. I'm also quite interested in talk a little bit in my work, and increasingly more in my work, about, and this is really about the movement of the data and how the data will spill from genealogical uses to forensic uses to medical uses and back again, and how to the extent that, Abby Lippman was right about when she, suggested that in this case, medical genetics was leading to a kind of geneticization in the way that we think about medicine, and the case of her work. I think it is this spillover, the fact that we are sort of saying that genetics plays a role in all of these social domains and sites kind of simultaneously, that is centrally important. I think, arguably, we can argue about this in the Q&A, more than it is in some cases in the kind of use of it in one place, genetic ancestry testing, and the work that might do around forms of essentialism. To me, it is the sort of wholesale geneticization in many sites. I think that it's what we should be concerned about. So let me talk a little bit about how this works. This is just a couple of quotes from the people that I spoke with. Someone I called Sarah says, "We think breast cancer runs in our family. Now that I understand my African ancestry test, the company I mentioned before, started by 2 Black founders, the difference between the mother's line and the father's line and all that, I have a better sense of what my genetic counselor at the doctor's office was telling me." So in the individual's sort of conception and experience of genetic ancestry testing, this is from early on in my field work, that people understood very early on that there was a kind of transitive quality between these 2 tests, that the information about genetic ancestry had something to do with how they think about breast cancer, and sort of the sort of genetic predisposition for disease. Someone I called Martin says, I was never really interested in genetic science or the genome or whatever until I heard about these genetic genealogy tests. After I took my test, I wanted to learn everything about genetics. I started reading articles in the newspaper, science magazines, journals, and these sorts of things, which is here to suggest how genetic ancestry testing, I think, offers a kind of threshold into geneticization for people who previously might have been marginally interested or not terribly interested. And lastly, Pat, who I write about in my book, also offers for us how genetic genealogy provides potentially a kind of halo effect over other forms of genetic testing. So Pat here says, "I've seen people let off of jail sentences based on DNA. I'm not questioning about DNA given my experiences. There is no reason to doubt the technology." And in this case, Pat effectively worked in a forensic laboratory for criminal justice laboratory in a large city in the Midwest, and was talking about her experience working in this laboratory. So of course that halo effect extends to the Innocence Project, which today has helped to exonerate nearly 300 people based on genetic testing, often of cold cases or cases in which the evidence was curious or unresolved, including this gentleman who was Andrew Hatchett, who was exonerated after serving 25 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. This is the case I use most often when I talk about, or the slide I use most often when I talk about the Innocence Project, because it does go to the gross injustice and racism of our criminal justice system. That said, it also, I think, is important for us to understand that this halo effect really only could exist in a society in which mass incarceration is de rigueur. If it wasn't the case that we didn't have a racist, unjust system of mass incarceration, one wouldn't need something like the Innocence Project. But here we are, and we might imagine the Innocence Project arguably to be a kind of reconciliation project as well. In this case, literally reconciling a family. Genetic ancestry testing, of course, also, this is part of the social life of DNA of recent years. The use of, consumer databases that really come out of a kind of ethic of altruism and of sharing. It comes out of an ethic of open science. So there are kind of third-party applications, such as one called GEDmatch, which might be familiar to you. That, and not unlike the sort of WikiTree site that I showed you about for the Isaac Hawkins family, the family that was Isaac Hawkins, who was a member of the GU 272. So people will compile their data to see if they can learn more about themselves and those in their families, and to be able to sort of, they themselves participate in the analysis of their data over and against what a company like 23andMe or Ancestry.com provides them. So they take that data and upload it here. So in the case of GEDmatch, began to be used by the criminal justice system to look for alleged serial killers. Often it's also more recently been used in assault cases. So there's a question of proportionality with regards to using, public data. It was the case that people didn't know when they signed up for this that it was possible, or that it was, an option that the criminal justice system might be using their genetic genealogy data in this way. GEDmatch this past summer was sold to a forensic, technology company. So now people have to specifically they're supposed to be opted out. There was a breach over the summer also, in which everyone was opted in and to allowing the criminal justice authorities to have access to their data. So it's a really kind of big unregulated mess. And I think that, as I mentioned, I mentioned the kind of the sort of communal ethic of wanting to share one's data, and what has happened to people who have endeavored to do that. In this case, these databases are disproportionately people of European descent, and so it raises the question of this idea. There's often this sort of case discourse around genetics, which is sort of like, if you've not done anything wrong, what's the problem? Everyone should be in the database. But of course, that discourse is quickly changing when increasing numbers of people are left to be vulnerable to the sort of surveillance by the state in this way. And genetic genealogy appeared in yet another way. I'm sorry, the slide's slightly off. This is from a couple of years ago, 2018, and when the Trump administration was beginning to separate families who were refugees or seeking asylum, mothers from sons. And you'll recall that there were scores of children who had completely lost their families altogether. Families were totally disconnected. And in this instance, the direct-to-consumer genetics company 23andMe offered that they might use their technology to help relocate families. So lots to say here. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but part of the social life of DNA is that it's increasingly sought to kind of fix tragedies like this that should not happen. In this case, it didn't occur. But certainly we have to sort of be worried both about the surveillance, who would have the data, how the data would be, sort of disseminated and circulated or not. And then questions about the sort of violence it does to kinship. I mean, the assumption that of a genetic biological tie being the only way to render genealogy is, part of the violence that's taking place here potentially as well. And then just to wrap up, just kind of 3 instances in which genetic genealogy and genetics more generally are coming to be, increasingly sought to try to explain the COVID-19 disparate, racial health disparities. So some of you might be aware that 23andMe has a COVID-19 research study. They've already had some early findings and preprints suggesting that people's blood type, which we know from the history of science and the history of race science, has been tied to forms of kind of raciology, we might call it, in the past. So that's not explicitly said here, but that is implicitly part of the argument. This piece from USA Today, this is from June. Why do some infected with the coronavirus escape COVID-19 unharmed? It's probably in their genes. So this is a kind of big, large global project in which people are looking for kind of the outliers, which is also quite interesting because of the kind of racialization around whiteness and some of the early data around youth that was taking place here. And then more recently, there's a case here that I wanted to point out. about showing that suggesting that there's a gene or gene expression in a nasal membrane and a bronchial epithelium, a nasal epithelial that would make African Americans more prone to be susceptible to COVID-19. I want to point out the kind of logical leap that happens here. This is from the abstract. So it goes from suggesting that these nasal and bronchial epithelium might have something sort of an activating quality to SARS-2, and then they go on to say gene-related activity in prostate tissue has been associated with higher incidence of prostate cancer in Black men versus white men. And so there's a kind of logical leap here from sort of nasal and bronchial tissue to prostate cancer tissue, which we know to have also high disproportionate rates of racial disparity and gender disparity as well, racial disparity rather, excuse me. So that part of what we're facing with the social life of DNA and this sort of geneticization as genetic genealogy really has become an explanation for many things as it's moved out of the space of genetic genealogy to the criminal justice system and elsewhere. And indeed, also ancestry testing is being used as a kind of threshold and an entree for the precision medicine initiative, and a way to encourage people, particularly communities of color, to participate in this large study that endeavors to collect a million Americans' DNA for health research. So the social life of DNA is alive and well after the pandemic and continues to be turned to DNA to offer explanations about the racial present and the racial past, the racist present and the racist past. Thank you.
Oh, that was a tremendous presentation, Alondra. Thank you so much for giving us so much to think about, and also for your timeliness in helping us as we try to wade through issues of racism in science and technology and our lives in general. I think I'm going to start off the questions myself. I have a bunch of questions, but the irony of the fact that DNA testing is used so blithely to incarcerate people, in particular African Americans, and is yet rejected so seemingly blithely when people try to use the technology to connect with their past, just seems stunning to me. I mean, is this just another example of the way in which racism is marbled through our institutions? How do you really think we should think about that?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Deborah. I think I think this is a sociological answer in part, but it is that social location matters. So it is not the test, it's not only the tests themselves. So, I end my book in talking about this issue that we, on the one hand, think that the tests offer some kind of trans-historical sort of truth, or that genetic analysis does, but it's clearly the case that it only makes sense in certain contexts. And so it is the institutional context that give them more or less truth value, that give them more or less authority. And so, in the context of the criminal justice system, you have all sorts of kind of institutional, intermediaries that get to say whether or not the test, has validity or can be used in certain ways. In the direct-to-consumer market, the sort of agent there, such as they are, or the imagined agent, let's say, is the individual consumer. And so, one can sort of say, this is what my, genetic ancestry inference says, and this is, I should be able to have access to this community or access to this right or this responsibility. But there's no kind of institutional structure necessarily to make someone abide that. So I think really kind of social site matters for, as an answer to your question about how the use of the technology could be sort of blithe and careless in one way and kind of, constrained in another.
Yeah, exactly. Very nice. I'm going to take a question from the audience. I'm just going to read this question from the Q&A. DNA has a social life, but is basically invisible to us as lay people who aren't geneticists. How is something as effectively mysterious as DNA made palpable, visual, or relatable to everyday people?
Oh, thank you for that question. I wouldn't agree that it's invisible at all to lay people. I mean, I think it's everywhere through and through. I mean, there are, should you be, do your genes say that you're supposed to use the paleo diet or some other diet? Are you, do you are you part of that small part of the population that has, 2 to 5% Neanderthal? That all of these kinds of stories and kind of flights of fancy about what genes are, what they mean. I mean, they're all kind of very flat, narrow, and essentialist conceptualizations of genetics. But I think, the point that I was trying to make, expanding from the Lippmann work, is that, imagine her, making the case for geneticization in the 1990s, when it's in very limited use and sort of clinical medical encounters, and a moment now in which, people can, again, tell you if it's, claim to tell you if you're taking the right diet. And moreover, it also is, claiming to be the kind of bleeding edge of, what's going to cure everything from cancer to indeed COVID-19. And so but please, I hope the person who raised this fascinating question will say more if there's more to be said. I would disagree that it's invisible. I think it's actually hyper visible. I think that it's and pretty much every site that one could imagine in life, and that it's true that certainly lay people don't know about the sort of intricacies of it. But I think what we've been seeing with COVID is that both in medical science and other kinds of science, that part of the collapse of what we thought was a kind of scientific infrastructure for for pandemic and other kinds of catastrophe, disaster, emergency, has left people to figure it out themselves. So I also think it's not mysterious because we don't have reliable kind of science around COVID, and so people are left to, I think, say to themselves, if I see this USA Today article, which is what probably by far the largest read newspaper to the extent that people are reading newspapers in the United States, I've got to weigh for myself. And, it makes sense to me that there's probably some, genetic reason why people aren't getting COVID in this case. So I'm not sure. I mean, it could be, I would love to have, if others disagree, I'd love to hear it. And it could be, again, the kind of overdetermination of my own research, but it feels quite all over the place to me and far from mysterious.
Thank you. Another question. What are your thoughts on the partnership between DNA home testing companies and pharmaceutical companies, particularly in the sharing of DNA databases? Will this lead to another, and I'm sorry, BDIL?
Beidel, yeah.
Beidel, yeah.
Yeah. So Beidel is, I'm not even sure if it's still around, some kind of, it was a beta blocker heart drug that through some shenanigans with p-values and all sorts of other things ended up sort of being a test that was supposed to work in African Americans. So it was this African American heart drug that Jonathan Kahn and others have written about so powerfully. And a few things. I mean, we can talk about this, I think, through 23andMe, which is the big example of exactly this kind of partnership. So 23andMe, which is now known to do ancestry testing, does not begin as a company that sets out to do ancestry testing. So in the early years, the company is only just offering, kinds of forms of genetic analysis about, the self, but that's not particularly about ancestry or, racial inference or sort of nation state inference and the like. And the big sort of strategic plan is always about pharma. So, part of the, if one of the kind of cornerstone stories that we need to tell ourselves about direct-to-consumer genetics is the story of these African-American early adopters, another of them is that, someone, a company that helps to build the field has always been about pharma, that the pharma was the sort of mission and aim and strategic goal from the very beginning. And then they had to go back to ancestry to get people in their database, because that's the thing that individuals, what is the thing that motivates and incentivizes people to give you their DNA. And moreover, particularly in the early days of 23andMe, to pay you $1,000, like to give you something that they can never get back and to pay you to take it from them. Now 23andMe is, $100 or $200 or something, $199. So that kind of DNA home testing in pharma has been, a kind of central mission from the very beginning. And the sort of threat to databases has always been there. And it's always been, people have always had to read the fine print to kind of understand that this DNA data will be used, effectively in perpetuity for forms of potential pharmaceutical research without, with the hope of therapeutic gains for the people who contributed to this kind of, one might call it a kind of crowdsourced project, but without any material, return back to the people who, again, paid to give the company their DNA to put in their database to do the research. So that sort of threat has always been there with regards to the testing. And I think, this is not part of what the question was, but I think thinking about exactly this kind of conjunction of home testing and big pharma, of, big DNA home test, direct-to-consumer testing and big pharma, is also the kinds of kind of thought experiments that we should be thinking about in our larger conversation about data and society more generally. I think that because we are dealing with, unlike, Facebook or some of the big tech companies, data that we understand to have come from people to already be racialized, and potentially to already have kind of stakes, limitations and threats, that for me, this is a kind of very rich site for thinking about the sort of economy, the political economy, in the racial economy of data in this moment more generally.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from my colleague, Dwight Banerjee. He writes, bioethical regulations that exist in the US emerged after controversies over experimental testing on Black bodies. Are existing biomedical and legal bioethics proving adequate in protecting, regulating, and guiding direct-to-consumer DNA? From your talk, my guess is your answer is no. What then should institutional bioethics look like to be effective?
Oh, this is a great question. And this is what I've been thinking about quite a lot now. So yes, the answer is capital N, capital O, exclamation point, no. I think, but it's not only bioethics. So I guess I'll offer two, a kind of more meta answer and a more specific answer. The meta answer is that we need to understand 23andMe and this whole sector of direct-to-consumer genetics as startups, as coming out of Silicon Valley, and as being engaged in the work of disruption. So in the same way that Uber and Lyft wanted to disrupt the cab medallion, all of the kind of regulations around taxis and livery cars, these companies explicitly and implicitly have disrupted the kind of normative ethical infrastructure that we had put around genetics and DNA. And that allows them to do their work because, it's not clear where they fit, who's supposed to regulate them. I did a paper with a former student of mine, Joan Robinson, about who's a JD PhD, precisely about the FDA and their sort of inability in the early days of 23andMe, about 7 or 8 years ago, to kind of figure out what to do with it. Like, is it a medical device? Is it like, how do we think about it and the sort of norms and rules that we have? And the inability to really do that leaves the companies, much like Uber and Lyft, to sort of do whatever, they want to do. So I think that there's the bigger context for that. And then, of course, that we don't have adequate bioethical apparatus at all for thinking about this. And part of it is because we can't, that part of the risks don't sit in a clinical medical space. So these aren't things that can be captured or regulated by having the right IRB. They're not things, the sort of levers that we've put in place to deal with bioethics just don't work here. And moreover, to the extent, as we're seeing with the Trump presidency, to the extent that bioethics worked in part because there was normative pressure on stakeholders in a system of medical research, right? Although we have obviously cases of egregious abuse, but to the extent that, doctors, genetic researchers and the like felt they had some normative moral responsibility, either because they were, good actors in the world, or they understood like the shame and kind of, normative, the kind of collapse that would fall on top of them, if they didn't behave. We don't have that with a company like 23andMe, or, we'll use that one, but any of the companies, some of the actors in the companies are academic researchers, or they come out of the academic space. Some are still, practicing geneticists like Rick Kittles, who I write about in my book, but many of them are, really good data scientists, and who don't come out of a space of or feeling hailed at all, or interpolated at all by a bioethical way of thinking about the world. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's really, I think, for those of us who are, I don't consider myself a bioethicist, but who think about how important bioethics has been, even with its quite tremendous failures, and at least endeavoring to put some guardrails around things. We no longer, all of the systems, the stakeholders, the institutions that are assumed are all different now. And, I think it needs to be really reimagined wholesale, and direct-to-consumer genetics offers, one way to the case to think about how that needs to be done.
Right. Let me just say here, for those of you who joined us late, if you'd like to ask a question, you need to go down to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in a brief question. And if time allows, I will pose it to Dr. Nelson. We have a new question, anonymous. I'm the DNA invisible question asker. Let me clarify. DNA evidence has saved a whole bunch of people, reconciled a whole bunch of people, and incriminated a whole bunch of people too. For example, so-called saviors are memorialized in a variety of ways. How have you seen DNA rendered visually as savior, reconciler, or incriminator? How is a prisoner shown that DNA is the thing that has proven them innocent or guilty?
Okay. Very different question than I thought it was. Yeah, very good. I thought immediately actually of the moment in Rebecca Skloot's book about, for those of you who read it, about Henrietta Lacks and her family, and that moment in which her daughter Deborah they're in a laboratory somewhere and is given a sort of test tube, a kind of refrigerated test tube that maybe is in, and said, this is, I don't know if the phrase is this is your mother, but effectively that in this test tube is the kind of tissue, the living tissue of the HeLa cell line. So it is, the visual visibility is a kind of abstraction like that. But I think, I don't know enough about the process of the Innocence Project. I imagine they're shown, court documents or documents from laboratories or something that are to your point, I think, abstracted from lay people. But one way that I will answer it, your question though, through my field work, is that what becomes clear very early on as this sector of this industry kind of emerges, the startup industry, is that the companies bear, if they're going to be successful, they bear a responsibility to do the visualizing work that you suggest, like to make these genetic markers, which are maybe meaningful to people, like you give them sheets and sheets, or you give them to them on a USB or something, but that it's a challenge to do meaning making with a USB or with 100 sheets of paper that have genetic code printed out on them. And so the companies engage in the visualizing work themselves. So African Ancestry makes very early on a certificate of ancestry, so it's something that people can sort of hold on to. They also give them a letter that explains things. 23andMe begins as a kind of Web 2.0 social networking endeavor. So it was always about these, graphs, charts, change over time and one's data and the like. And so so I agree with the kind of implicit assumption of your question, which is that having to visualize something that is abstract is part of the work of what these tests, what one must do to give DNA a kind of social life. So yeah, that's definitely true. And I think the companies were very keen on that. And I also, it's also the case that part of the visuality of this, all that I write about, is about the culture of the reveal, which is created explicitly in the early days of these companies to build a kind of effective ritual around direct-to-consumer genetics. So it's not by chance that there becomes a whole sort of coterie of YouTube videos, or people feel that they have to behave in a certain effective way about the test. The companies very early on film these reveals as part of how they're trying to convince people. Again, this is a startup. How do you convince people that this service, this social practice, should be around and is useful for their lives? And this kind of effective performance through video actually became a large part of what gave the industry an anchor.
Interesting. Another question. What do you think about the option of DNA testing kits allowing users to have a say in the racial categorizations, in their racial categorizations, and then having that data be aggregated in the company's databases? For example, 23andMe is the example.
Interesting. So that's a really fascinating question. I mean, I think by default that already happens a little bit, and that certainly in my work, and also now you see in Aaron Panofsky and Joan Donovan's work about white nationalist use of genetic genealogy, that there are a few kinds of strategies that people use. So there's these kind of, which are either, accept and embrace, deny, go into a kind of sort of high rationality mode of trying to deal with the sort of margins of error around assumptions that are made if you have access to that data. So there's all these forms of negotiation that individual consumers do to achieve what I call their genealogical aspirations, so that people come to the testing experience with questions that they want to answer. So in the case of kind of the race and ethnicity inferences that people are given, something happens. Like, so I could be told that I'm, like we can use this, the example of Skipgate. So earlier on, 10 years ago or something, who knows if Skip used the same test, the same company now, what the results would be, but what the inference would be. But 10 years ago, I think Hadad was finding that he was 50 or 60% European American, something like that. But he goes around in the world and no one, at least in the US context, mistakes him for, a white man, and so part of the giving people say over the racial categorizations, I mean, it only is part, it's only half of the equation. The other half of the equation, of course, is who people in the various communities that we circulate and sort of say we are, recognize us to be, and that's about rights, responsibilities, forms of culture, and the like. But I do think it's an interesting exercise. I mean, there's, and certainly easy enough, I think, for any of these companies to accomplish. I would say it is particularly interesting given that I think it's been in the last 2 weeks, it was early in September, that Ancestry.com came out with a press release that said, particularly for their kind of British Isles, Scottish, Celtic inferences, that they had improved their database and improved their algorithm, and all of the findings that you might have thought that you had about Scotland or England or whatever have changed. And the sort of press releases and the blog posts around trying to make people not freak out about this. So there was all of this, like, it's better science, it's a better algorithm, our database is bigger, don't worry if you don't have any Scottish anymore, these things are overlapping anyways. So there's also the sort of shifting categorization that's happening on the side of the company. And then, of course, with Ancestry in particular, as I mentioned, because it's a subscription service, they want you. So if you read that, if you've stopped your subscription, they say better science, better database, better algorithm, you might have changed. We wanted to warn you that you might have changed. Are you going to renew a subscription that's lapsed for 2 years to sort of see if you've got more Scottish or more Irish, or, you might. So there's also this kind of, there's a kind of capitalist incentive built into the companies, particularly those that do a subscription service, to constantly be changing the data, to be adding new algorithms, new kinds of visualization to the question and the prior question and the like.
Very nice. Mark Adenoff asks, can you help us think more about the racialization of COVID? I am struck by media narratives pivoting back and forth with notions that this is a Black or POC disease. I am thinking about what to make of Vice President Biden answering a question on race in the US during the debate with a statistic about the staggering Black death toll for COVID.
I think, Mark, we're going to be kind of trying to figure this out for a good while, and much as we'll be trying to figure out what we're living in, what we've been living in for the last 6 or 7 months for a good while. And it's a little bit why I'm particularly interested in the kind of white outlier case, because I'm interested in what that, these cases about. So there was today, I think, or yesterday, there was a paper that came out and said that people who have, this Neanderthal DNA marker are, more likely to be severely ill from COVID, right? And so the Neanderthal genetic inferences have already been kind of racialized as white. So there's, so there's that piece, or as European. Then we've got the outliers who don't get COVID, also presumably because they are of European descent. Then we've got the quick collapsing of, there's a genetic predisposition, we think, for prostate cancer in Black men. So clearly, and, nasal tissue, it must be the case for COVID-19 as well. So it strikes me as being a moment, and, as we would talk about, I think, in STS, is where everything is unsettled. So it's a moment of, like, to use the STS language, controversies in teacups, as opposed to tempests. So there's all of these kind of controversies or kind of assumptions of science that are getting unsettled and resettled. And it'll be interesting, I think, to see what becomes the kind of larger, what becomes the meta narrative in which we talk about the racialization of this moment. So I don't have a great answer, Mark. I'm just talking back to you, I think, about all that there's a kind of visibility about lots of different kinds of racial essentialism happening, including European, happening at once, because we're in this kind of moment of kind of high uncertainty. So I find it obviously kind of, heartbreaking, particularly given the rates of COVID in Black and brown communities, and, that are just staggering and sad, and exist, in my own family and close to my own family. But I think it's for those of us who think about race and science and race and technology, right? And in this case, through what kind of technological means are we making claims about the relationship between COVID and race? It is a kind of all hands on deck moment for trying to kind of figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this will be our final question from Chrislyn Leroy. What do you make of 23andMe's new partnership with Airbnb? Given the relatively modern origins of nation states, how might ancestry tourism impact notions of racial territorialization?
So I don't know this Airbnb partnership. I mean, I take it from the question that it sounds like it's more of the same. Like, your 23andMe test says that you're Scottish, so come and rent this Airbnb in Edinburgh.
Don't know.
Yeah. So, I think that it pretty clearly, easily actually falls into, fairly established social science literature on ethnic options and on symbolic ethnicity. I mean, this is work from the late 20th century. So it's, I think we could think about it as a kind of 21st century iteration of, people buying kilts and practicing St. Patrick's Day, in the St. Patrick's Day parade, and drinking green beer and all of that, that there are these kind of manifestations of ethnicity that are, that exist in the symbolic world, that offer signals to ourselves and to others. And throughout are highly commercialized. So I don't know enough about it, but given what I could glean from your question, that's what I would offer.
You know, I said that was the last question, but now I have one I want to wrap up with.
Share is prerogative.
Well, it has to do partly with the position you hold at the SSRC as well as your own scholarship. It seems to me that at this time in our lives, with Black Lives Matter, with the state of the country, what do you think about the idea that we can no longer afford to just tell stories to the academy, that in fact, our scholarship has always been political, and why are we shy about that? Should we be embracing the political in a way that historians, for example, have been resistant to doing? Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree what I take to be the sort of implicit argument that you're making in your question. I mean, you know, to the extent that this is an unprecedented moment, it's a moment for, you know, reckoning and I think self-reflection for all of us. And, you know, part of what I've written with my SSRC hat on has been, you know, a little bit, Deborah, about this point, which is not only should we not shy away from the politics that are already, always already, to use that academic, you know, nugget, always already in our work, but that our work is, you know, that we know the answers to so much of this already, you know, like we, you know, we know why, you know, public schools don't work because they're underfunded. We know why there are health disparities. You know, we know why, you know, that the COVID-19 disparities, you know, are about other forms of kind of layered and entrenched kind of poverty and inequality. And so I think I think what we can no longer afford to do, in addition to, I think, having more public facing work, and not everyone has to do that. Some people are better or not good, you know, or better or not at it. And maybe it falls to organizations, you know, like the SSRC to help with that work. But I think we can all no longer be, that we need to shake ourselves out of the privileged position and the narcissism, frankly, a kind of scholarly intellectual narcissism of being captivated by figuring out ever smaller mechanisms of like, you know, like, so yes, you know, we know that we have ripped apart our social safety net. So our schools, you know, and the tax base. And so the schools are terrible, but let's figure out if it's, you know, state tax at the cash register, or if it's, you know, like that, you know. So on the one hand, yes, we understand that those small questions are important for getting at underlying mechanisms. So we always need to do that work. But I also think there needs to be, you know, some of us who are just able to say, you know, if you strip a society of a social safety net, like this is what happens to education, this is what happens to healthcare, and these are the outcomes. And we don't need any more research, and we don't need any more description to do that. And so I'm both interested, and I think we all need to be more interested in work that's honest about the politics, work that moves beyond description, and work that is willing to engage the public in new ways. And a colleague at the Institute for Advanced Studies shared with me earlier this week this you know, Hannah Arendt quote, which I thought is so powerful, and we can end with it. I'm paraphrasing, but others might know it, which is that, you know, we don't need, you know, new aphorisms. We don't need new kind of diagnoses. You know, we need better stories well told, effectively. So, you know, I think that's it.
That is a beautiful thought to end on. Dr. Alondra Nelson, many, many thanks from all of us at MIT for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Deeply honored and really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.